What if I told you that Ferrari lived half a year with a problem that was right in front of his eyes? That Hamilton's performance was not the pilot's fault, but of a millimeter crack misunderstood for months? This is not just a technical failure. It is a story of collective blindness in the elite of the F1. Today I tell you what Vasseur found, what changes for Spa, and why Hamilton could be about to resurface. For a team like Ferrari, with a template of hundreds of engineers and latest generation simulation tools, face such a nightmare behavior. Because in Formula One, what you cannot measure, you cannot fix. And when the data is contradict, the uncertainty scale. In Miami, one of the worst scenarios of the year, both pilots reported that the car changed balance between Sector 1 and Sector 3. Literally, a Ferrari entered the curve and another left it. In that context of confusion, and with a streak of mediocre results in his pocket, Vasseur knew that something deeper was failing. It was not a matter of pilots or pure aerodynamics. The problem came from the car architecture itself. And that suspicion was the first step towards the finding that would change everything, but that, for months, was hidden at the naked eye. What they found was as disturbing as revealing. In the structure of the rear train, right in the area where the upper triangle of the suspension is anchored to the crankcase of the gearbox, signs began to appear that no one expected to see at this point in the championship. Microfissures in the composite material, caps with irregular wear and deformed fixations. That is, a structural degradation that had not been detected by conventional car sensors or by the usual track analysis. These microscopic imperfections were not large enough to generate a catastrophic breakage, but they were enough to alter curve car behavior. In extreme load conditions, the anti-quat angle, that small but vital adjustment that determines how the rear suspension behaves when accelerated, varied without control. This meant that the car could lose up to 5 mm high on the rear axle suddenly. For any other car, that figure would be a nuance. For a latest generation Formula One, it is the difference between being competitive or becoming a pilot nightmare. But the problem went further. The oscillations of the platform the small ups and downs of the moving car made it impossible to maintain a stable rake configuration. And in Formula One, the rake, that subtle inclination of the car forward, is one of the keys to generate efficient aerodynamic load. If the rake changes by uncontrollable factors, as he did in SF25, aerodynamic flows are altered, the diffuser loses efficiency and the tires begin to operate outside their ideal window. All this explained why the car was so difficult to understand. Ferrari could carry two identical configurations to a track, one for Leclerc and another for Hamilton, and receive completely different telemetrias. What worked for one for the other was a disaster. The reason? Hamilton's car suffered this ghost wear that unbalanced the rear and made, in full acceleration, the car changed its height unpredictably. Literally, the suspension moved more than due, but only when the load conditions demanded it. It was not something visible in the simulators, even in the standard data. It was an intermittent failure, dependent on variables so specific that it went unnoticed even for the best team engineers. The most serious thing is that this defect was not the result of a blow or a bad installation. It was a design problem that, due to its complexity and location, had overlooked all the usual quality controls. Vasseur understood it instantly. They had lived half a year with an internal enemy, a ruling that not only stole rhythm in the race, but also conditioned each adjustment, each strategic decision, and each championship race. This discovery was a turning point, not only for what he revealed about the car, but for what he said of Ferrari's technical approach. It was a brutal reminder that in modern Formula One, invisible details can destroy entire seasons. That even a team with millions of euros, wind tunnels, and supercomputer can be the victim of their own confidence. And above all, that sometimes the most dangerous is hidden with the naked eye. The most shocking thing about Vasseur's discovery was not only what he found, but the time he had remained hidden without anyone detected. 4 months, Ferrari had been adjusting a car whose internal structure was gradually deforming, millimeter to millimeter, every time he went on track. And the inevitable question is, how could this happen? How a team with the resources, technology, and experience of Ferrari can overlook such a fundamental failure? The answer is not in technical ignorance, but in sophistication of the problem. The defect that affected Hamilton SF25 was what engineers define as a ghost stiffness, a form of flexion or deformation that occurs under very specific dynamic conditions and that is not manifested in traditional static tests. In other words, when the car was at rest, or when it underwent bank analysis, it showed no sign of weakness. Only under certain loads, in specific combinations of traction, temperature, and compression, the failure appeared. And he did so intermittently, so subtle, that the sensors did not mark him as an anomaly. In that context, telemetry data generated an illusion of normality. When the car varied its height in full curve or lost traction suddenly, it was attributed to external factors: side wind, rubber differences, incorrect tire pressure, or even piloting errors. Traditional telemetry, despite its accuracy, is not designed to detect micro-modems and real-time structural components. And that was the trap. Another element that hid the problem was the architecture of the SF25. Ferrari had opted for a more compact integration between the crankcase of the gearbox and the suspension anchor, an aggressive solution that promised to save weight and gain rigidity. But that same decision also hindered visual and physical inspections. To review these areas, the rear train was needed to completely disassemble, a task that is rarely done between race weekends due to limited time and the risk of bad reinstating the set. In addition, the rotation between the race and test units also played a role in this collective blindness. In each GP, Ferrari alternate between new parts and already used components, and many times the symptoms were different. In a weekend, the car seemed to work well. In the next, the same setup caused a total uncontrol of the balance. This inconsistency diverted attention to more obvious variables: strategy, asphalt temperature, degradation. No one thought that the car was literally changing behavior because their guts were giving under pressure. This type of error is not exclusive to Ferrari. In the recent history of Formula One, there are multiple examples of structural failures that took months to be discovered for being camouflaged by the complexity of the system. But in this case, the severity was greater because it directly affected the performance of a 7-time world champion that came to the team precisely to add points, lead the development, and return Ferrari to the podium on a regular basis. Hamilton, meanwhile, began to notice from the beginning that something was not right. Its piloting style, very sensitive to tensile and braking behavior, amplified the effects of the failure. And even so, even for him, it was impossible to point out precisely what was wrong. The car reacted different every lap, as if he had his own life, as if something inside the chassis was moving without permission. For months, the SF25 was a black box for Ferrari, a structure that hid a critical weakness just in the backbone of its performance. And the great lesson is that in Formula One, it is not enough to have talent, money, and data. Technical humility is needed, the ability to question everything, even what seems more solid. Because sometimes the problem is not in the software, neither in the pilot, nor in the motor maps. With the problem finally identified and corrected, the Ferrari SF25 of Hamilton, and by extension, that of Leclerc, could be at the gates of a radical transformation. The car that until now had been an unknown, a puzzle impossible to solve even for the most experienced engineers in Maranello, is now a car with a predictable, controlled, and, for the first time, optimizable behavior. This is not a lower correction. It is a complete reconfiguration of the rear axle in terms of dynamic response, which opens the door to a new range of strategic possibilities for the second half of the championship. Spa-Francorchamps, the next calendar stop, is one of the most demanding circuits of the calendar. Not only because of its high-speed curves and sudden elevation changes, but for its ability to punish any aerodynamic imbalance. Eau Rouge, Blanchiment, Pohon. Each of these sections pushes the car to the limit of loading, stiffness, and trust of the pilot. And it is precisely in this type of path where the previously hidden failure of the SF25 was more lethal. Each microflexion generated an alteration in the rake, each unexpected compression converted the platform into a source of chaos for the tires. All that could now have been neutralized. The simulations that Ferrari carried out after implementing the corrections soon yielded promising results. In Mugello, during the tests after Canada, the SF25 showed much more stable behavior in the rear, and the sensors confirmed that the height oscillations had been reduced to acceptable margins. In practical terms, this means that the car can now maintain the same configuration of aerodynamics, load, and traction throughout a career batch without the need for reactive adjustments. For Hamilton, this is equivalent to recovering a work tool that for months felt an unstable trap. The implications for the rest of the season are huge. From Spa, Ferrari can optimize setup and tire strategies without constant fear that the car will degrade without prior notice. This will allow them to be more aggressive in classification, take better advantage of track evolution, and especially execute more consistent races. They will no longer have to sacrifice speed for security or compromise aerodynamic load to avoid sanctions for skate wear. After a beginning marked by frustration, forced adaptation, and lack of results, the British could finally find that symbiosis point with SF25. He will no longer be the pilot who seeks to understand an unpredictable car, but the competitor who leads a technical and sports comeback with the experience of 7 titles in tow. So Spa is not just one more race. It is the beginning of a new chapter.